conventional military forces that could potentially be used in a variety of different ways. And so this would give a variety of choices. It's not just going to be either or, one or the other. You're not just going to have a couple of options. But again, let's really sort of train our military and get more of a standing military so that we can, do things as needed. Now, on the one hand, you could say this was really a good thing, right? I mean, it makes sense for America to have more military options. Um, but the issue is, if you have more options, there's also the need for greater judgment. There's also the need for greater restraint and good decision making. And this becomes an issue. I mean, again, again, all of a sudden, American troops end up in Vietnam, and looking back, a lot of people say, should we really have been there? Well, again, you need leaders at the top who are going to. They might have options of where and when to put troops, but again, sometimes there's the need to say no, we're not going to get involved there, and so on the one hand, a lot of people say this is a good thing. It gives the president more options, but then it's very important that he and the people at the top really, again, are using good judgment and good decision making. When Kennedy came into the presidency, he was particularly interested in the third world. And again, I mentioned this before, that when the Cold War began, people began talking as though the world had divided into three parts. You had the first world, and the first world represented, democracy and capitalism. This is the world of Western Europe, the United States, Canada. Then you had the second world, and the second world was the world of communism. And the world of communism was, of course, based in the Soviet Union, but also Eastern Europe and China. And then you have the third world, and the third world was everybody else, right? So the third world was Latin America, Africa, Asia. Sometimes people talked about this as the developing world, because again, it was economically and technologically behind. It was also decolonizing. Different parts of Africa and Asia especially were decolonizing. And so when they became independent and no longer colonies of a European empire, which way were they going to go? Were they going to be a part of the first world, or were they going to be a part of the second world? And Kennedy was very interested in the third world because he basically thought that Europe was in a stalemate. Again, on this map, the first world is in blue, the second world is in red, and the third world is in green, right? And this Europe was basically a stalemate. Western Europe was in the first world, Eastern Europe was in the second world. And so if you were really going to make a change, it seemed like the Cold War was at a stalemate. If you wanted to sort of push it out of the stalemate and get an advantage, you had to do that in the third world. And so that's basically, that's basically, again, what Kennedy sort of thought. So to sort of win over the third world, Kennedy believed that, again, we had to have good relations with the third world, and he worked to increase foreign aid, particularly to Latin America. So again, he gave money to areas and countries in need. He also wanted America to really present itself well in terms of media images, that we had this appealing way of life, and that kind of thing. And another program that he started was known as the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps was basically, again, volunteers. People who went and volunteered to work in the third world. It could be teachers or doctors or nurses, and they would volunteer for 1, 2, 3 years to be in the third world, try to help the society there, but also to establish better relations between the United States and these countries of the third world. And this is still a program that is, a part of our government even to this day. And the Peace Corps was really one of Kennedy's most popular programs, one of the most popular new programs that he developed. But even though Kennedy tried to, influence the third world in, through economic aid, through sort of persuasion or media or influence, he did also sometimes rely on military means to influence the Cold War as well. And early into his presidency, again, he backed a CIA-sponsored assault on Castro's Cuba, and so again, it became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. But again, just to give you the background, Castro came, to power in Cuba in 1959, and again, within a year or two, declares himself a communist and on the side of the Soviet Union. And again, this made Americans very nervous because, they didn't like having this communist neighbor right next door, some 90 miles from Miami in the United States and Florida. And so people in the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, began planning this plot against Castro. And there were these Cubans that had fled Cuba. They had left Cuba because they were so upset about Castro and his new government and what his new government was doing. And so these Cubans who were against Castro were basically sort of organized by, people of the CIA, the American CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and our military began to help sort of organize them and train them so that they could go back to Cuba and lead some sort of military assault on Cuba. And this plan involved, again, about 2,000 Cubans who, strongly opposed Castro's regime. But again, they were given military training, they were given military weapons and aid by the Americans. And you can see here, they landed at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. On the screen here, there's a little bay right there. And the plan was that if they could land, sort of gain strength, gather more supporters, then they could go up and take Havana, the capital of Cuba, and take Cuba back, again for the non-communist Cubans. But basically, this was a disaster. It failed. Shortly after they landed, there was a military group from Castro's forces that easily defeated them. And within 2 days, this invasion basically fell apart. The people who had led it were, killed or captured. And basically, it was clear, just because of the weapons that they had, and there was some air surveillance too. America was sort of watching things from the sky. It was very clear that this group had been trained and armed by the CIA, and that the Americans were involved with it. And so again, this created great hostility in Cuba. Sometimes even people who didn't like Castro were, again, bothered that the Americans were getting involved and influencing this situation. And so this had clearly failed. Now, I do want to point out, Kennedy only came into the office in, January 1961 was his inauguration, right? This took place in April 1961. So this was actually planned back during Eisenhower's times. I mean, an invasion of this sort would take a long time to plan, months and months. And so the idea actually started under Eisenhower. Eisenhower gave it initial approval, but then Kennedy gave it final approval. And basically, again, this was a disaster. It was all over the world in terms of the newspapers and the media. But Kennedy got out there once again in front of the press, gave a brief speech and basically said, "I'm sorry, it's my fault. It was a bad idea. I'm sorry it failed." He said all the right things, and many Americans, gave him high marks because even though this failed, he came out and took responsibility. He didn't try to blame other people, for what was, something that happened under his presidency, that happened under his watch. But it taught Kennedy important lessons. He would be much more careful in trusting the CIA and military advisors. He basically realized, I can't just trust what their ideas and what they're saying. I've really got to, again, make careful decisions here. And basically, at this point, Kennedy resolved that he was going to rely even more heavily, argue more, on his brother. And his brother, this is his younger brother here on the left, Robert Kennedy, was appointed Attorney General of the United States in John F. Kennedy's cabinet. And people at the time were quite critical of this. They said, this is nepotism. Why are you appointing your brother to this job? Robert F. Kennedy was a lawyer, but still, I mean, to be the top lawyer of the land in charge of the Justice Department, he was relatively young and inexperienced. But if you look at the advice he gave his brother over the course of his presidency, most people looking back say, you know, they're very glad that Robert F. Kennedy was there, because he really did become John F. Kennedy's most trusted advisor. And Kennedy realized, I can't always trust the military and political advice I'm getting around me. At the time, this was the leader of the Soviet Union. His name was Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev, as you can see by this Life magazine cover, he was actually a Soviet reformer. He followed Joseph Stalin, who, of course, was this very brutal dictator of the Soviet Union who killed millions and millions of his own people. And Khrushchev followed him and actually did a lot to reform the Soviet Union within. And so he was a Soviet reformer. But even though he reformed things at home, he could be quite bold and quite aggressive abroad. And again, he wanted to be a tough leader when it came to the Cold War. And so even though he was a reformer at home, again, he projected strength abroad. And Khrushchev and Kennedy were very competitive men, just in terms of their personalities. And, again, Kennedy is inaugurated in January 1961. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion happens in April 1961. And Khrushchev basically gets the impression that, again, this is a weak person here, leading this country, leading the United States. And so again, he takes away from the Bay of Pigs that Kennedy doesn't know what he's doing, and he's quite weak, and I can sort of intimidate him or do whatever I want to influence him. And what happens is that Khrushchev and Kennedy met for the first time shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion. They do this, again in Vienna, Austria. And basically, they met for, again, a couple of hours. They talked about a wide range of things. And you see the two men sitting here, Khrushchev and Kennedy, but there are also pictures of them standing up. And, from the outside, it looks like everything's okay. But in reality, this was a very difficult meeting. And Khrushchev basically spoke in a very aggressive way. He spoke with very harsh rhetoric. And basically, he threatened to take over the city of Berlin, West Berlin. And because West Berlin, again, this island of democracy and capitalism in Germany, was causing all sorts of problems. And when Kennedy left this meeting, he was really shaken. He was very emotionally and psychologically bothered by this meeting. He got the impression that Khrushchev could be a very aggressive person in the Cold War, and that he could, start some sort of military conflict. And Kennedy really was shaken after this first meeting in person with him, because he just sounded so aggressive and hostile. And in response to this meeting at Vienna that they had in '61, Kennedy does order more military troops to basically be stationed in West Berlin. Again, West Berlin was like this island of capitalism and democracy in a larger communist country, the communist country of East Germany. And again, it was creating all sorts of tensions in East Germany and in Eastern Europe. And so again, Kennedy wanted more troops there, just to sort of say, if you try anything, on West Berlin, we're ready to fight, to fight for this. But in the early 1960s, the Soviets were becoming increasingly concerned with the situation of this divided city. It was particularly embarrassing to the East Germans that a lot of East Berliners were able to escape relatively easily from East Berlin to West Berlin. And again, East Germans would go to East Berlin and then escape to West Berlin. So again, people were getting out, and then from West Berlin, they could fly to anywhere in Western Europe or in the world. So, again, people kept escaping. And to solve this situation, what happened was in the middle of the night on August 13th, 1961, in the hours before dawn, people started building this wall between East and West Berlin. So again, people living in Berlin had no knowledge this was coming. They just woke up one morning and saw all these soldiers out there building this wall. And again, this began to be built on August 13th, 1961. And again, this was the plan that the government of East Germany, as well as Moscow, approved it. The Soviet Union basically approved the building of this wall to, keep people in. This, of course, became the famous Berlin Wall, and this served as a physical symbol of the Cold War. It represented the fact that Berlin was divided, that Germany was divided, that Europe was divided, that the world was divided. So again, it represented a divided city, country, continent, and world. And it became a very heavily guarded wall with guards shooting at those trying to escape. And over the decades, dozens of people were shot trying to escape this wall. There were also, a couple of attempts to go under the wall and build a tunnel. So this was a major, presence, there in Berlin. And publicly, when this was built, Kennedy spoke out against this. He later went to Berlin. He gave a very famous speech in Berlin. You can see it here. This is my very bad German. Colin can correct me here, but ich bin ein Berliner, right? I am a Berliner. And he basically said that all free people are like West Berliners because, again, they value freedom so much because, they know the importance of freedom. He really, again, sort of, condemned the wall. And one of the things he said in his speech, too, is that freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. And, this is interesting because, last year our academic theme was borders and boundaries, and so we were talking about walls and barriers and things like this. But the Berlin Wall is one of these rare situations where a wall was built to keep people in. Usually walls are built to keep people out, but this was built to keep people in. So you can see here that Kennedy made these strong statements publicly against the wall. But what I want you to know is that when the wall first went up, Kennedy said to people in the White House, to people around him, that he was relieved. And he said, "I'd rather have a wall than a war." And that, he was really scared after this meeting with Khrushchev that Khrushchev was actually willing to start a war over Berlin. And so even though publicly, he condemned this, privately, he realized it sort of relieved tensions. And I'd rather have a wall than a war. And, it's not ideal, but, it's better than the two superpowers going to war at this. Colin, just to sort of pick on you, do you have anything more to say here?
No, not really. That was exactly how I learned it here in Germany.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thank you. I just thought I'd check. Berlin and Germany, for a while were a dangerous situation because it was a place where these two superpowers might really conflict. But another, of course, very dangerous place where the two superpowers conflicted was Cuba. And really the height of tensions during the entire Cold War, you could say that the height of tensions, came about because of Cuba. With the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place again, like over 13 days, in October 1962. And so again, the height of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States came with this Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically what had happened is that the Soviets assisted Cuba in the construction of military bases, and then they put medium-range nuclear missiles there. within close range of the United States. Cuba basically again was looking for some means of defense after the Bay of Pigs invasion. They thought the United States would come back again, so they asked the Soviet Union to help them with building up their military and military bases. And then this idea came that let's not just have bases, let's have medium range nuclear missiles. And the Soviets had actually started to do this already in the summer of 1962, but we just really sort of verified it and figured it out in October 1962. In October 1962, U.S. spy planes really figured what was going on in Cuba. And to Kennedy and other Americans and top people in the American government, the placement of these weapons so close to the United States seemed like an act of aggression. And, Kennedy, again, needed to figure out some way to respond to this. And it was a crisis that lasted for 13 days, as I said, and there's a very famous book on this. I use it in some of my classes because it's a very good book. It's also, it's relatively short. It's quite brief. It's not a long read. So if you're interested, I do recommend it. But Robert F. Kennedy was advising his brother, John F. Kennedy, during these 13 days when the world sort of stood on edge, really on the edge of a potential nuclear war. And so again, it was very tense 13 days, in October 1962. Basically, Kennedy, once he found out what was going on in Cuba, and after he took, a day or two to, gather advisors and figure out a way to respond, he basically went on television and publicly stated and made clear that the United States would not accept these missiles so closely to the United States. And some military advisors were telling Kennedy to go in and invade and attack Cuba and remove the missiles by force. And of course, the fear was, again, if Kennedy would have done that, the Soviets would have responded with force too, and you could have gotten into World War III. And so, Kennedy comes up with a different option. Kennedy and other advisors, including his brother, come up with a different option. We can't do nothing. On the other hand, we can't attack aggressively. That might start World War III. Let's start a naval blockade or a naval quarantine, and let's stop all supplies from going in and out of Cuba until the missiles are removed. And so, again, he publicly, went and stated this and made it clear. And again, during the crisis, there were military men in America who wanted him to be more aggressive. There were military men in the Soviet Union who wanted Khrushchev to be more aggressive. And again, both of the leaders did, end up restraining themselves in this. And they tried to have some sort of form of communication to work through it. The United States also went to the United Nations and made a case about removing the missiles of the UN, and won over, the majority of world opinion, the majority of public opinion for this. The countries of Latin America also backed us fully on this, and Latin Americans don't always agree with the United States, but in this case they did, because these nuclear missiles could hit them too. Here on this map, you can see that the circle right here is how far these nuclear missiles could have reached. And again, they could have gotten, into a significant part here of the southern United States. But then here, right around Cuba, you see the naval quarantine. So we had U.S. Navy ships all around here, not allowing, ships to pass through here. And, this quarantine went on then for days. And then ultimately what happened was there was negotiation. And basically what was negotiated was that the United States would promise not to try to invade Cuba. It would not invade Cuba again. And in response, the Soviets would remove the missiles. And so that's what was announced, to the Americans, to the world. Again, we would not invade Cuba, and they would remove the missiles. And so the crisis came to an end. And in many ways then, it seemed like a clear victory for the United States because, again, the Soviets backed down and were removing the missiles. But what was not known at the time, and actually did not come out until the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, was that we also secretly agreed to remove missiles in Turkey. You know, Turkey was a NATO ally, and we had placed similar nuclear, medium-range nuclear missiles in Turkey, which was right next to the Soviet Union. And we said that we would remove these two, in exchange for the Soviets removing these weapons from Cuba. Now we didn't that, but we got it so that that would be private, that would be secret. And so we didn't. That did not have to be announced to the world. And because that did not have to be announced to the world, again, this looked like it was very much a crisis that resolved in America's favor, because the Soviets were backing down publicly. Again, we also removed some missiles too, but again, that didn't come out until the 1990s. Um, Even though, again, the crisis was resolved, and you could say that, again, in terms of the world, it was resolved so that America really, again, sort of saved more face or was in a better position. Kennedy was not at all relieved by this crisis. Kennedy was, in fact, very disturbed by this. And again, leaders in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev and others, were disturbed by this too. It was a very sobering experience. And generally, it's considered that the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest point that the superpowers came ever to nuclear war, because, again, if one side had acted aggressively and then the other side had acted aggressively in response, you could just see how it could ratchet up, where each side would be more aggressive and the other side would be more aggressive. And if it had gone in some aggressive direction, people say it could have gone to all-out nuclear war. And Kennedy himself said that he thought there was a 1/3 possibility that it could have gone to nuclear war if different decisions were made on either side. A 1/3 possibility. And that really bothered him. He thought, how can two people basically have it in their power to destroy civilization as we know it? And so it was very, very bothersome to Kennedy. Again, one book there's, a variety of books on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but you can see one description of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that this was one hell of a gamble, to sort of keep the peace and keep the country at war. But there were some positive things that came out of this. One, I mentioned they were trying to keep up communication, but that was actually very hard. It was indirect communication. Well, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was decided that there needed to be a direct phone line between the White House and the Kremlin, so that the American government and the Soviet government could talk immediately if there was need for urgent communication. And so this hotline, or this phone line between Moscow and Washington, D.C. was set. It also pushed the superpowers both to talk more about nuclear negotiations. They were working on negotiations to limit and ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere, because it damaged the atmosphere and nature. And again, they did that. And that was significant because it was the first time ever, they did that just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the first time ever you had a nuclear agreement between the two superpowers. Kennedy also began to think and speak in different ways about the Soviet Union. He took a new tone of accommodation. And in June 1963, he gave a speech at American University down in Washington, D.C., and he gave a speech on the topic of world peace. And in that speech, basically, Kennedy said, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered lacking in virtue, for in the final analysis, our most basic common link is we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And it's just a remarkable speech. It's a remarkable statement. Even if they are our enemy, they are also human. And what are ways that we can sort of find common ground and find our common humanity? It's just a remarkable speech. And what's so remarkable about it was it's so different from what you heard in the inaugural address. That we're going to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, oppose any foe. It's a much more aggressive stance. And, it's very different. This speech in 63 is very different from this speech in 61. And what happened to bring about the difference? It was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 62. And so it really does change the way that Kennedy, is thinking about the Soviet Union, the Cold War, foreign affairs, everything. And this does begin to lay the foundation for a time period known as détente, which we'll talk about more in a couple weeks, where the two superpowers are getting along better. It doesn't really last; the Cold War continues, but you do begin to have again just more communication going back and forth between the two superpowers. But again, Kennedy gives this speech in the summer of '63. As you know, by fall, Kennedy is killed. The Kennedy assassination took place on November 22nd, 1963. This was just a shocking assassination. Um, and maybe because he was so young, because it was, I mean, again, presidents had been assassinated before, but this in particular really shook people and bothered people because seemed like he was this young president of so much potential. And here you see where it happened. He was in Dallas, Texas. He was actually starting to think about running for president again in 1964, and he needed Texas. He needed to win Texas again, so he wanted to shore up support in Texas. And he went to Texas, and you see him here with his wife Jackie in the open convertible, and he was shot, in this convertible and killed, in a very violent way on November 22nd, 1963. The assassin, you see pictured here on this screen, it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was, arrested shortly after this, but then killed by someone else even before he went to trial. And so, this also caused concern. And was there some conspiracy? Why was he killed so soon? We didn't get to hear from him. But again, there was a government report that looked into the assassination. It became known as the Warren Report. Because, again, the Warren Commission was led by Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. He investigated this with others in government and basically concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, although there are still some, conspiracy theories out there today. But I would say most people believe that it was, just Oswald. But again, there are always, sort of different theories sometimes on these surprising and shocking assassinations. If you go to Dallas, there is a museum, and it's called the Sixth Floor Museum. And it was, again, at this sixth floor where Lee Harvey Oswald shot out the window and killed Kennedy. So it was the place that Kennedy was going through the streets on, his car, in his car, and he was shot from this building. And the museum now is sort of a memorial to Kennedy. It's about him, his presidency, but also about the assassination. I was there years ago, and it was well done. And so if you get the chance, you can visit that if you happen to be in Dallas. Kennedy, just in terms of his presidency, usually he rates pretty well by scholars. He usually comes out in the top third. Again, we have had 44 or 45 presidents, depending on how you count Cleveland. And the top third then would be the top 15. So he comes out in the top 15 of 45 presidents. And I think this is even a little bit generous. And the reason I say that is he wasn't president that long. He wasn't even president 3 years. And, so we have less to judge him on. He really didn't get things through Congress very well. He did do well on handling some foreign crises, like Cuban Missile Crisis. That's part of the reason for his high ranking. But again, he was very much known for his style and his speeches, and sometimes people think he was lacking in substance. He also had several affairs, over the course of his political life and the presidency. And, nowadays that's really considered, a much more serious thing. Back then it was considered sort of a private matter, and the press didn't report on it. But nowadays, people would just be, just what, I don't know what to say. I'm not even talking about the moral aspect of it in terms of his wife. I'm talking about national security. If you're having an affair with a woman and you're president of the United States, that's grounds for blackmail. You could be and again, these different women could be trying to influence him in his politics in some ways. I mean, it's just considered, dangerous for national security to be having these, types of relationships that are really reckless. And like I say, some foreign power could be planting a woman or finding a woman that had an affair with him and trying to get her to talk or exposing it. It's just these days it's no longer considered just a sort of personal choice, let alone now we're in the Me Too movement, and are you doing this in a way that is against gender equality and things like this. But anyhow, despite the fact that he was having these affairs, his wife was faithful to him, and she did much actually to preserve the Kennedy legacy and preserve his reputation and really his mystique. And she wanted to make sure that her husband's funeral, was just this very dignified and momentous event. Immediately, after he died, she, just ordered the people at the White House to go dig in the archives and find out what was done at Abraham Lincoln's funeral. And she wanted the exact, type of funeral for Kennedy that Abraham Lincoln had, which is why you see him here, his body, flag draped coffin on a carriage going through Washington D.C. This was all mirroring the funeral procession that was given to Abraham Lincoln. And here you see Jacqueline Kennedy again, the widow in black. You see Robert Kennedy here on the right, and Edward or Teddy Kennedy here on the left. And these are the two kids, of course, John Jr., and who has since passed away as well, and also Carolyn. Carolyn's the only member of the family still living here. But another thing that Jackie Kennedy did, is she talked with this very famous and well-respected reporter, a man by the name of Theodore White, and she gave him a long interview about, Jack, as she called him, or John Kennedy. She often called him Jack Kennedy, and their life together. And she discussed how she and John, or Jack, loved the musical Camelot. And Camelot, at some point on Broadway, I don't think it's played on Broadway for quite some time, but this was a musical on Broadway around this time. And of course, there were records out with the music. And she, just reinforced how much, she and Jack liked Camelot. And Camelot is the story of King Arthur and his knights. And so she was sort of saying that, Jack was like King Arthur. And if you know the legend of King Arthur, again, at the heart of the legend is what might have been if he had lived longer and been king over his kingdom and ruler longer. And so, this was sort of, life in Camelot. This became sort of the Kennedy administration became known as the Camelot years. That again, we had this good king, John, and great things could have happened, but his life was cut too short. And so she tied this, the themes of this musical into, again, sort of the legend of Kennedy, which again helps create his legend too. But keep in mind, he was president for 3 years, and he was then followed by his vice president, and his vice president, of course, was Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson was sworn in, shortly after he was shot and taken to the hospital. It was clear that he was, going to be dead. He was dying from these wounds. Sort of immediately, again, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president. You can see Jackie Kennedy right next to him. But Lyndon Johnson comes into the presidency in '63, because he's vice president through the assassination. Then he goes on to win one more term in office. But you could argue that Lyndon Johnson, in that first year, from '63 to '64, when he's ending Kennedy's presidency, he gets more done in 1 year in terms of getting through things through Congress and legislation than John F. Kennedy had done in 3 years. So again, he had the talent to really get things through Congress. And so, in this way, you could say that Johnson has a better reputation than Kennedy. Of course, the thing that would ruin Johnson's reputation was the Vietnam War. And that is, again, sort of one of the mystiques with Kennedy. Some people say, well, if Kennedy was still living, we would not have sent ground troops to Vietnam. It's true that lots of presidents, including Kennedy, sent advisors and military aid and military support, but we didn't actually put boots on the ground or soldiers on the ground, so to speak. But that's questionable. That's sort of plain what if history. Johnson kept all of Kennedy's advisors, and so his cabinet was very similar. Is the same military aides that were telling Johnson to go into Vietnam would have been telling Kennedy to go into Vietnam. And so some people say, we just don't know if that's true. Now, on the other hand, John F. Kennedy was a person of more confidence. And because of the Bay of Pigs, he didn't always listen to military advice. So he might have had the strength to say no to these military men, whereas Lyndon Johnson didn't feel as strong in, foreign policy. And so he tended to listen to the advisors a lot more. But again, this is all debatable, and we don't really know because Kennedy, died and Johnson lived. And but some people argue Johnson just was following the path already set for him by Kennedy to put more and more troops in Vietnam. And so again, we'll get to that more when we get to Vietnam. On Thursday, I want to talk about civil rights, which of course Kennedy and Johnson were both involved with, and then. On next week we'll get into the Johnson presidency more, and we will also get into Vietnam more. So good. I feel like you were a little quiet today, but maybe you have comments or questions for me now. Again, I'm just going back to the list and seeing who's here. I see Carly joined us. I don't know if there's anybody else